Our featured speaker today has spoken for SALA almost as much as anyone else has here. He is a founding member and community activist with several organizations, and his work as a filmmaker has been featured on Discovery Channel, Netflix, etc. Please make a warm welcome for our speaker, James Witker.
Awesome, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm just going to raise this up a little bit. Thanks so much for inviting me back to talk to you a little bit about humanism this morning. Some people here, I think, know this is one of my favorite things to talk about. So, humanism, what does this word mean anyway? It's a little bit vague sounding, perhaps. And I think there's some confusion about its definitions over time. There was the tradition of Renaissance humanism. Renaissance humanism, which referred to arts and study not directly connected with the church at the time. But these days, when we talk about humanism, where religion, politics, and culture are concerned, we're usually talking about the worldview known as modern humanism, scientific humanism, secular humanism, or just humanism with a capital H. I think humaning while isming is a totally legit definition. You should use that more, it's totally true. Now, I've sometimes heard the contention that humanism is just a more diplomatic synonym for atheism. But no, humanism and atheism are compatible, but they're really answers to different questions. Dale McGowan is credited with saying that for those who have left traditional religions behind, atheism may be the first step, humanism is the 1,000 steps that follow. Michael Werner, as passionate an advocate for humanism as I know, writes that humanism is merely that ongoing, evolving life stance that challenges us beyond atheism and agnosticism, beyond our own self-centeredness, and beyond our fear of larger commitments to embrace the best what we and our larger society can be. David Breeden somewhat loftily says humanism has a mission, freeing the mind and saving the world. There are many takes on humanism because it's a diverse movement and a collective ongoing project that nobody owns, right? It's not a given set of beliefs or new dogmas to replace older ones, but rather a dynamic approach to the world that's always subject to revision with new knowledge. But where did it all come from? I think that the history of humanism, including the history of secular and humanistic communities, is fascinating because it's both longer and more complex and diverse than we may have heard. So I'm going to attempt to sketch that complex history in about 15 minutes. So yeah, there have always been doubters, right, and reform-minded freethinkers in every period in history, but in a few places and times, they really built legacies and communities. In ancient Greece in particular, several centuries before the Common Era, some of the classical philosophers founded schools based on materialism, which was their best attempt to understand the world based on observation and logic. The materialists intuited that the world is made up of tiny interacting particles that obey natural laws rather than the whims of divine entities. The concept of the atom originates with Democritus more than 2 millennia before its existence was proven, and Epicurus, importantly, founds an influential community called the Garden, which was skeptical of supernaturalism and devoted to ideas of reason, maximizing happiness, and minimizing suffering in life. Centuries later, during the time of Julius Caesar, the Roman poet Lucretius, Titus Lucretius Carus, expounded on the thought of Epicurus in an unprecedented epic literary work called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. It was a 7,500-line epic poem in 6 books that presented a naturalistic picture of the world and a striking subversive message. Do not fear the gods, do not fear death. We are temporary beings in a world larger than we are, but we can understand a larger world without a greater meaning, but we can understand the world by studying it, and we can create meaning and happiness while we're here, and we can appreciate its beauty. Lucretius was accused of being an atheist, and along with the ideas of Epicurus, this work was lost for many centuries after that period. And it has been, I think, convincingly argued that the rediscovery and recirculation of this literary work at the dawn of the European Renaissance had a huge influence, inspiring artists and scientists of the period that followed, helping to usher in the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution that followed. Stephen Greenblatt argues this in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Swerve, arguing that the ideas of Lucretius and Epicurus largely helped to shape the modern world that we know. Out of the European Enlightenment, of course, came deism, a philosophy held by many of the American founders, including Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Ben Franklin, and others. The deists, I like to say, were sort of the proto-humanists of their time because they didn't believe in a creator that was knowable or was involved in the world. They championed reason and science, and they were certainly skeptical of religious authorities. That skepticism was built into our founding separation of church and state. Jefferson, for his part, owned at least 5 editions of Lucretius's poem, and he declared in private that he considered himself thoroughly to be an Epicurean. By the late 19th and early 20th century, science had accelerated dramatically, and discoveries were challenging long-held assumptions about our human place in the universe. Darwin published his theory of evolution, which was foundation-shaking. Advances in physics and astronomy via Hubble and Einstein and others revealed that the universe is incomprehensibly more vast than people had traditionally thought, and much older. Many religious institutions, of course, were highly resistant to this new information, this new knowledge. But some interesting things began to happen on the more progressive side of religion at this time. So Felix Adler was the son of a prominent rabbi who was expected to take over the leadership of his father's large synagogue in New York City. But as a college student, the young Adler had immersed himself in classical philosophy and natural sciences, and he caused quite a shock when he instead proposed a new vision to his family and his congregation, a congregation no longer based on ancient scriptures or supernaturalism, free from theology and creed, but united by reason and a humanistic ethic for all humankind. The idea was controversial at the time, but he did go on to found the New York Society for Ethical Culture in 1876, perhaps America's original God-free congregation, and it's still going today as a small but persistent movement, with a movement that followed, which is the American Ethical Union, now often called, now ethical culture. The name of this movement is often referred to as ethical humanism. By the late 19th century, Unitarians and Universalists, which were the most radically liberal Christian denominations that had long rebelled against traditional dogmatic beliefs of Christianity, had become even less tethered to their theological roots. They'd done away with creedal requirements. And in 1917, John Dietrich, a minister who had come to the Unitarian ministry after being defrocked by his native Reformed church for his heretical views, began to articulate a human-centric worldview similar to what Adler had argued for, based on reason, compassion, and social justice without regard to theism. By all accounts, it was Dietrich who first used this term humanism in America to describe this worldview, this life stance, and he reportedly drew crowds in the thousands when he spoke about humanism in Minneapolis during that time. I see already the coming of a day, Dietrich famously said, when people shall come to the church, not for what they can receive, but for what they can give, not the company of the saints, not the assembly of the converted, not the congregation of the righteous, but a host of servants of the common good, of fighters of the good fight for truth and justice. This is the new church of the new era. So humanism took hold quickly among Unitarians and other liberal clergy at the time, and in 1933, leaders in this young movement came together to sign the first Humanism and Its Aspirations of 1933, the first Humanist Manifesto, to found what we now know today as the American Humanist Association, And they wrote in the preamble to that first manifesto, "The time has come for widespread recognition of the radical changes in religious beliefs throughout the world, the modern world. The time has passed for mere revision of traditional attitudes. Science and economic change have disrupted the old beliefs. Religions the world over are under the necessity of coming to terms with new conditions created by a vastly increased field of knowledge and experience." In every direction, the vital movement is now in the direction of a candid and explicit humanism. Shortly thereafter, humanistic Quakers, founded the Humanist Society of Friends, which we know today, or some people may know today, as the Humanist Society, which is the organization that trains humanist celebrants. So, see, originally humanism was understood as a religious idea, if not a religion itself, because it was seen as a replacement for the traditional religion, or religions, practiced in community where it would supplant Christianity or Judaism as the governing, the uniting philosophy. And this had quite a bit of success in its time. Humanism became quite dominant when the Unitarians and Universalists merged together, and it helped to define the new non-theistic principles of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And as some of my friends know, that story of humanism and Unitarian Universalism is a complicated one that would take a long time to go into. But suffice to say that many UU congregations do remain quite humanistic. So the first Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, where John Dietrich was based, was founded as a humanist congregation. Today calls itself the birthplace of congregational humanism. And you may notice on that sign there that they call their Sunday service Sunday Assembly. And I have it on pretty good authority that goes all the way back to the beginning, not a recent development, so that's interesting. We have the UU Humanist Association, which I serve on the board of, that promotes humanism in the wider UU world and the wider world. In 1980, this term secular humanism becomes popularized when the Council for Secular Humanism was founded by Paul Kurtz and others who wanted to really differentiate humanism from religion, from churches, and from those older movements. And that has always caused, since, I think, some confusion about the difference between secular humanism and religious humanism. Religious humanism is a little bit of an anachronism now, but it was the term traditionally used by the Unitarians, ethical culture, and Quakers to describe their, practice of humanism in a congregational context. So today, more often people say congregational humanism, humanist community, perhaps. They really are the same philosophy. The most current definition of that philosophy from the American Humanist Association is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion, affirming the dignity of each human being. It supports the maximization of individual liberty and opportunity, consonant with social and planetary responsibility. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of the open society, standing for human rights and social justice, free of supernaturalism. It recognizes human beings as part of nature and holds that values, be they religious, ethical, social, or political, have their source in human experience and culture. Humanism thus derives the goal of human life from human need and interest rather than from theological or ideological abstractions, asserting that humanity must take responsibility for its own destiny. So, of course, the 2010s brought a new wave of humanistic and secular communities with groups like Sunday Assembly and Oasis and a few others that cropped up around the same time. That are not necessarily branded as humanist in name, but I think they're certainly shaped by humanist ideas. So I want to leave you with a question to ponder. Humanist ideas have been highly influential in our time. The early 20th century humanists founded the ACLU and the NAACP. Ideas and language from the first Humanist Manifesto found their way into the UN's landmark Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Humanism influenced the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, and feminism in the work of pioneers like notable humanist Gloria Steinem. So why is it that humanism has changed the world, yet communities of humanists, people who identify with humanism, has always been small and with limited appeal compared to organized religion? And, you know, these communities have been difficult to sustain, as some recent, you know, articles have been discussing. I'm not sure. This is something I like to explore, and I'd love to talk to you about it. It seems to me that given the current state of affairs on our planet, humanism is something that we need more of. So to close, I will once again quote my friend Michael Warner. In our troubled times, I think it is time to look beyond society's failings, the universe's inherent meaninglessness, and our avoidance of grand purposes. Being a humanist these days takes passion, courage, and commitment. It requires a love of life that can help us rise above our age's vacuous, cynical malaise and empower us with a vision of what a humanistic society would look like. Humanism is that grander vision of life. It is a devotion to humanity and the biosphere that humanity is part of. It is our passionate commitment to the best ideals that are supported by what experience, science, and civilization have taught us. This vision tells us that humanism is larger than any of us. I believe we have a duty to continue humanism's evolving tradition, which has inspired countless individuals to make the world better. At the same time, it motivates us to fill our lives with transcendent purpose for a meaningful, exuberant life worth living. Thanks.